Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Elite Eight and all the matchups from this past weekend. Now we are going to be diving into some more NBA, as we just got news this morning from Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN about the fact that Joel Embiid is set to return from injury as soon as tomorrow night's game. So we're going to be diving into that conversation here. The story was put out this morning that it is looking like he is trying to ramp up for the playoffs, trying to get a handful of regular season games under his belt before the 76ers try and make a postseason push. Embiid last played on January 30th against the Warriors. It was a tough game. He was really laboring through it with a different knee injury through a lot of that game, and then ultimately went down with this left meniscus injury that led to him having to get surgery that happened in the fourth quarter, and it has kept him out since then. He got that surgery early in February. Headed into that January 30th game versus the Warriors, the 76ers were the 2 seed in the East at 32-16. Since then, they have gone 8 of 19 and are currently the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference playoffs. Seems like they are going to be fighting their way through the play-in tournament to come out of it. We'll see how this plays out, how soon that Embiid is able to return. As it currently stands, they are 2 games behind the Indiana Pacers for that 6th seed. They only have 7 games left in their season, so would take quite the run here. And ultimately, I think that more than anything, the seeding isn't the biggest concern for them. It's sort of, what does Joel Embiid look like? Because there is a lot of conversation surrounding whether or not the Sixers should bring Embiid back for a potential playoff push. So we'll get into sort of the thought process behind that, because Embiid is somebody who has obviously dealt with injuries through his entire career. It caused him to miss the whole first year after he was drafted a handful of years ago in the 2014 draft. He actually missed his first 2 seasons with a foot injury, and then even since then, it has been a massive conversation, is his injuries, whether it is the regular season games themselves, or it seems like every time the 76ers do miss the playoffs, or do make the playoffs, I should say, by the second round, he is dealing with some type of injury, and it's really inhibited his level of play to the point where he hasn't been the MVP caliber player that we see during the regular season, like we end up seeing the version of him in the playoffs. So that is a real concern, and there are some people who were sort of calling for Embiid to sit out the rest of this year, have the 76ers try and gear up and make a bigger run during next postseason, have him come in as healthy as possible. And I do feel like I was sort of along those lines. That's the direction I thought they should have gone with, but very shortly after Embiid went down with injury, we had the trade deadline. They end up making a couple solid moves, really, in adding Campaign and, more notably, Buddy Hield to their roster to try and beef up some of their other scoring options for as time comes here. And I do think when you talk about this conversation, the biggest thing is whether or not Joel Embiid wants to play, which it is clear that he does. And I do understand that injuries are such a big concern with him, and the fact that you want to ensure that he is staying healthy and he's not possibly hurting himself even more long term. But if he feels like he is ready to gear up for a playoff run, I do think it becomes very difficult for this Sixers organization to tell him no. The whole reason that Joel Embiid is known as the process is because of the fact that the 76ers spent years trying to bottom out in the standings and get as many lottery picks as possible. And he was ultimately the one piece that really hit from that era. So you have to trust the process. The process is getting Joel Embiid. So that's how, obviously, I'm sure you all know, that is the origin of it. But just to say that the fact that this is a team that was purposefully trying to lose, the process was losing, and then all of a sudden they get a guy like Embiid years later, and you get a guy like Ben Simmons, who of course was good for a stretch there, and immediately they just snapped their fingers and said, okay, well now it's time to win. But you've had this losing culture for all these years, and there have been some quotes from players in the past. I know that Evan Turner wasn't a long-term piece necessarily for Philly, but there have been former 76ers who really felt like their development was stunted because of the fact that they were trying to lose games, and that was just something that didn't click with the locker room, which is partially why you saw, along with some burner Twitters and such from their GM at the time, and you see him and their GM, their head coach, all sort of funnel out, and just tons of turnover in the organization as a whole, as opposed to just trying to maximize what you have. And I can't say that tanking never works. I do understand the reasoning for it, but ultimately now you look at all these years later, you have the reigning MVP, who was potentially going to be back-to-back MVPs if he had played enough games this season, was averaging 35 points per game earlier this year, along with his 11 rebounds and 5 assists as well. But to then say, no, we're actually not going to play you here, even though you think you can play, we're going to sit you down, get ready for next season, try and get into the lottery, add something else there, But that is a little bit of a tough sell, and it would require Daryl Morey, their GM, sitting down with Embiid and trying to lay out, okay, this is why it's better for you to not play the rest of this season. And keep in mind that Daryl Morey, we just had all of this drama with James Harden take place this past offseason that stretched into the beginning of the regular season, where he had promised James Harden this contract that was coming, and then ultimately he sort of switched up his thought process. He didn't give Harden the contract that Harden was expecting, and it just got very messy. And now you are expecting your other star player to sort of play out that similar role, which is just a bit of a risky move in my eyes, and it really has the potential to disrupt Embiid's willingness to stick around with Philly, where he was already dropping some hints during the offseason about the potential of him moving on somewhere else. Philly needs Embiid, and I understand that injuries are a big-time concern, but he is currently in his age 29 season. He just turned 30 a couple weeks ago, and ultimately he is going to, if you're a 76ers team that believes that Embiid is good enough to be your centerpiece for a playoff run, you have other good players, an all-star in Tyrese Maxey, a solid role player in Tobias Harris, you just added a Buddy Hield, and you have all of these other pieces. Ultimately, I understand you can make the argument of, well, next year we'll be healthier, we're going to have this cap space, Paul George is supposedly being rumored to potentially end up in Philly. There's just sort of a lot of ifs there in the future, and do I think that they have a great chance to go on a playoff run this postseason? Not necessarily, but it's also, I think it's really harming to your organization if your best player wants to play. You are conceivably in a place where you can be a contender, having your MVP candidate star player healthy is also sort of with an asterisk, because it's not like he's going to be fully healthy in theory this postseason, but you also don't know when he's ever going to be fully healthy. And if they can knock off the Celtics in round one, potentially. We'll sort of get into bigger playoff picture as the time comes, but if they were to take down a Celtics or a Bucks team in the first round, they can take down anybody, and that is going to be their biggest test. Honestly, it's probably better for them to have Embiid healthy for that first round series as opposed to trying to advance to the conference finals, which they haven't even done so yet up to this point, with Joel Embiid reach the conference finals and have the risk of Embiid getting injured somewhere along the way. So ultimately, this whole conversation is a little bit irrelevant because of the fact that he is going to return. And if that is the case, well, what are their chances? And I don't think that they're necessarily great, but I do look specifically at that. Again, they could potentially make their way into a 6th seed. I don't think that that's going to happen. We will see. Again, Tuesday night, tomorrow night, as we are recording this, is the first game that he could potentially come back. Their schedule isn't terribly difficult down the stretch, where they're then going to be playing in Miami. So those are the two hardest games. And then they're against the Grizzlies, the Spurs, the Pistons, the Magic, which are a solid team, of course, and the Nets. So, maybe, but it would take a lot extra. Either way, I don't think that they're going to climb up into the 6th seed. I do think that they could have a potential chance against the Bucks in the first round if they got matched up there, where they would be coming off of maybe a little bit of momentum, beating the Miami Heat to get to the 7th seed, and then you have an Embiid versus Giannis matchup with Embiid being fully rested. The Bucks have been definitely up and down through the second half of the season. They've shown some highs, they've shown some ability to play defense, but I also still don't know whether or not, Embiid gives you a chance in any series, in theory at least, and some of the supporting pieces, like I would choose Tyrese Maxey over Damian Lillard right now if you're asking me to build a team together, but I even still think in a 7-game series, I'm probably going with Maxey because the way that Damian Lillard has played this season, and of course he's going to be a Hall of Famer, and he's incredible, and he's still good for dropping 40 points on any given night, but there's also a handful of games where we've seen him struggle with this efficiency, and maybe it's more of a year 2 thing with him and Giannis, but that 2-man game still really hasn't developed to the level that we were expecting it to up to this point. So I feel like the 76ers could potentially have a chance, and if you beat the Bucks, again, it's them and the Celtics are the top 2 seeds in the conference. The East has a lot of solid teams, but at the same time, I don't think that there's any world beaters necessarily in the conference that the 76ers would have no chance against. And again, I'm not the biggest Sixers fan. I don't know if I ever really see this nucleus ultimately winning a championship. But if you're the 76ers, you've made all of these moves because you do. So trying to hold Embiid back from this doesn't really make all that much sense, especially if you're trying to retain him as long as possible. Now, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe conversations could have steered a different way, in that you can find a lottery pick, you can get Paul George in the offseason, but that's just not the case. And from here on out, it's, judging the 76ers on what level of a contender they are. And I don't think they're a top-tier contender. I don't think that they are a true threat to the Boston Celtics. I think it's sort of the Celtics and everybody else in the Eastern Conference, but they're right there with anybody else when they are at the peak of their powers. So we will have to see with that. But on that note, we will keep you updated on when Embiid is set to return as the week goes on, but expect it to be this week. But on that note, we are going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back, we will be diving into the past weekend in the NBA. So stick with us, and we will be right back.